The first sound was not the luxury store's quiet music or the gentle clink of glass shelves. It was a man's voice, sharp enough to crack the air like a whip. "Get out of here." His words hit the room with the force of a slammed door. Every head turned. Every breath paused. He stood near the display wall, a tall man in a crisp suit, face flushed with anger, one hand raised as if he could sweep the woman away with a single gesture. She stood a few feet from him, a black waitress still wearing her simple blue dress, her hands resting on her pregnant belly as if reminding herself to breathe slowly and not let fear rise. The overhead lights washed over the polished floor and the glass cases holding designer handbags, but the brightest spotlight in the room was the humiliation hanging between them. Her shoulders were tired. Her eyes carried the weight of a long shift at the diner down the block. She had walked in only to look at a pair of discounted shoes that she had dreamed of buying for months. She had not expected to be shouted at in front of strangers, but she did not step back. She did not lower her gaze. She did not let her breath shake. The manager's voice rose again, louder this time, echoing across the marble floor. "Did you hear me? I said get out." A couple near the counter gasped. Another woman covered her mouth in disbelief. Someone whispered, "Why is he yelling at a pregnant woman?" But no one moved. No one defended her. No one wanted to risk becoming part of the scene. Then the glass doors swung open. A gust of outside air swept through the store, bringing with it the steady footsteps of 4 men in tailored suits. They walked with a silence that carried more weight than shouting ever could. The man in front, a tall black man with a sharp jawline and a calm but dangerous presence, stepped over the threshold as if the room belonged to him. His eyes did not wander. They locked onto the scene instantly, reading every detail with frightening efficiency. Behind him, 3 bodyguards fanned out in a formation that made the entire store stiffen. The manager's voice faltered. A tremor of recognition passed through the crowd. They did not know his name, but they knew that kind of power. He was the son of a Mafia boss, a man raised in the shadow of influence, danger, and silence. Yet in this moment, his attention was not on the manager or the expensive displays. It was on her, the pregnant waitress standing alone under the harsh light, holding herself upright even as the room tried to push her down. Her heartbeat thudded against her ribs, steady but heavy. She felt the tension tighten around her like an invisible rope, but she still did not move. She refused to let shame take her voice. The manager tried to regain control. "Sir, this woman has no business here. She is causing trouble." But the words sounded suddenly small, flimsy, almost childish in the presence of the men who had just entered. The waitress did not blink. She did not flinch. She simply stood there, breathing slowly, waiting for the moment when the room would finally understand the truth. And that moment was coming, closer with every step the Mafia boss's son took toward her. The store did not breathe. Every sound seemed to fold into the thick air as the men in suits stepped fully inside, letting the glass doors fall shut behind them with a soft but final click. The manager straightened his shoulders as if trying to reclaim the authority he felt slipping from his hands, but even he could sense that something had shifted. The pregnant waitress stood beside the display shelf, her palms resting gently on her stomach, reminding herself to stay calm. Her baby shifted slightly, a small flutter beneath her hands, as if sensing the tension that coated the room like dust. She lifted her chin, keeping her posture steady even though her feet ached and her breath felt tight. She told herself silently that she had survived harder nights. She had survived long shifts with no breaks, customers who snapped their fingers, and managers who looked right through her as if she did not exist. She would survive this, too. But she could not shake the sting of the insult that still echoed in her ears. She had come in only for a pair of discounted flats. She wanted something comfortable for the coming months, something small to celebrate the baby she carried with hope and fear and love. She had walked toward the sale rack with a shy smile, imagining the shoes on her feet as she worked at the diner, but the manager had cut her down before she even reached it. His voice had hit her with a sudden force, telling her to get out, telling her she did not belong. His cruelty lingered like a bruise. The Mafia boss's son moved farther into the store, his steps slow and purposeful. His presence did not shout. It did not need to. Power lived in the calm way he carried himself, in the measured way he scanned every corner of the room, and in the cold certainty of his gaze. The customers instinctively parted, creating a narrow path that led straight to the woman who still stood alone beneath the bright lights. He noticed the pregnancy first, then the way her back stayed straight, then the tremble at the edge of her breath that she tried so hard to hide. Her strength stirred something in him, a quiet recognition of someone who had been forced to hold their ground more times than they could count. He stopped only a few feet away from her. His bodyguards stayed behind him, forming a silent wall that seemed to press the air tighter. She lifted her eyes to meet his. Her heart hammered, but she did not look away. She had been stared down before by people who looked at her and saw only her skin, her uniform, her exhaustion. But this stare felt different. Sharper. Searching deeper. The manager hurried across the room, his voice high and strained. "Sir, I apologize for the disruption. This woman came in without permission and is disturbing customers. We are asking her to leave." The Mafia boss's son did not look at the manager, not even for a second. His eyes stayed locked on the waitress, reading her face as if the truth were written directly across it. The manager kept talking without noticing he was being ignored. "People like her come in just to cause scenes. We try to keep the environment clean and safe, but she refuses to cooperate. I am sure you understand." The room tightened. Someone gasped softly. The waitress felt the words dig into her like small, sharp stones. People like her. Words that were meant to sound professional, but were soaked in judgment. She felt her throat tighten, but she forced herself to breathe slowly, letting the air move through her lungs with steady determination. The Mafia boss's son finally turned his head, just slightly, to look at the manager. It was not anger that crossed his expression. It was disappointment. A deep, cold disappointment that carried more threat than any shout could. His voice, when it came, was low and even. "Did you ask her why she is here?" The manager blinked, thrown off. "I did not need to. I know why people like her come in." A faint pulse of tension flickered through the air, sharp enough that even the customers felt it. The waitress tightened her grip on her belly, grounding herself. She could feel the moment building. A moment she never asked for. A moment she did not expect. A moment that would change the balance of the room. The Mafia boss's son took one more step toward her, closing the distance until he stood close enough that his voice could drop to something only she could hear. His eyes softened, but only for her. For 1 second. Then his gaze sharpened again as he turned back toward the trembling manager, and the entire room sensed it. The balance of power had just begun to shift. The manager kept talking, but the pregnant waitress no longer heard his words. Her heartbeat filled her ears like a slow drum, steady but heavy, the kind of rhythm that kept her standing when her body wanted to fold. She had survived long nights at the diner, survived disrespect wrapped in politeness, survived customers who treated her as if she were part of the furniture. But she had never been screamed at in a luxury store while carrying a child who had not even taken a first breath. The weight of it pressed against her chest. She reminded herself to stand still, to breathe, to keep her dignity intact, even when the room tried to pull it away. The manager stepped closer, as if her silence offended him. His face tightened with frustration. "I said she has no right to be in here," he repeated, waving a dismissive hand toward her belly as if it were an inconvenience. "She came in wearing those clothes. Look at her. This is a high-end establishment. We do not allow people who bring trouble." A few customers exchanged glances. The ones who had laughed earlier now looked uneasy, as if the cruelty was becoming too obvious to hide behind smiles. The waitress pressed a hand gently against her stomach. The baby shifted again, a soft nudge beneath her palm. She whispered inside her own mind that she would protect this child with everything she had, even if that meant standing alone in a room full of people who believed she did not belong. But she was not alone anymore. The Mafia boss's son took one more step toward her, and the sound of his polished shoes tapping the marble floor echoed with a quiet authority no one dared challenge. He stood close enough now that she could see the crease at the edge of his brow, a crease that suggested he had seen injustice before and had never learned to ignore it. She lifted her eyes to him, cautious but steady. She saw that he was studying her, not in the way men sometimes study women, but in a way that measured truth. He took in the exhausted lines under her eyes. The simple dress. The swelling of her pregnancy. The quiet defiance in her posture. She felt exposed under his gaze, but not threatened. It was strange, standing inches away from a man whose family was whispered about in back rooms and back alleys. A man whose presence alone could freeze the breath of a room. But the fear she expected did not come. Instead, there was something else. Recognition. As if he knew what it was like to be judged before speaking. As if he had lived long enough to understand that dignity did not come from money or marble floors, but from a person's willingness to stand their ground. The manager scoffed loudly, misreading everything. Sir, please do not be fooled by her sad look. People like her pretend to be victims. She is probably here to take pictures, cause a scene, or get some kind of compensation. I know this type. The phrase "this type" landed in the air like a blade. The customer stiffened. The bodyguards shifted their weight, just slightly, but enough for the room to sense the temperature drop. The Mafia boss's son finally tore his gaze from the waitress and turned fully toward the manager. His expression did not change. It did not need to. His silence pressed harder than any words. Then he faced her again, and his voice reached her in a quiet tone meant only for her. Did he hurt you? The question was soft, almost gentle, but the intent behind it was sharp as steel. She shook her head slowly, not because the insult had not hurt, but because she refused to let the manager's cruelty define her answer. The Mafia boss's son nodded once, a subtle acknowledgement of her strength. Then he stepped past her, positioning himself just slightly in front of her, not in a way that overshadowed her, but in a way that signaled something unmistakable. A shift. Protection. Recognition. The manager swallowed hard, suddenly unsure of everything. The customers sensed it too. Something unspoken was moving through the store like a cold wind. Something signaling that the balance of power was no longer in the hands of the man who shouted. It was slowly, silently, and inevitably shifting toward the woman who had stood her ground without saying a single word. The silence inside the store thickened as the Mafia boss's son stood between the pregnant waitress and the man who had humiliated her. His presence was not loud, but it carried a weight that pulled every pair of eyes toward him. The air felt tighter, as if the store itself understood that something important was about to be revealed. The pregnant waitress held her hands gently over her stomach, feeling the baby shift once more. She whispered inside her own mind that everything would be all right, even though she had no idea what was coming next. She watched the Mafia boss's son with cautious curiosity. She wondered why a man like him, a man whose very posture could silence a room, would step forward in her defense. She wondered what he saw in her that made him pause. But she stayed still, her breath steady. She had learned that sometimes the strongest thing a person could do was remain calm while the world tried to shake them. The manager forced a strained smile, trying to regain control as if the entire scene were simply a misunderstanding. Sir, I apologize if this looks unpleasant, he said, his voice cracking. We have rules in place to keep our environment respectable. This woman came in dressed like this and refused to leave when asked. She is clearly trying to cause trouble. The Mafia boss's son did not look at him. Instead, he asked the waitress, "Why did you come in tonight?" The question was simple, but his tone made it feel like something more, something deeper. She swallowed, her throat tight. Her voice emerged softly but firmly, the truth steady on her tongue. I came to buy a pair of shoes, she said. On the clearance wall. They help my feet when I work. Her hand brushed her belly for a moment. The baby makes standing harder these days. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Something shifted in the eyes of the customers, something like shame, something like realization. They had watched her stand alone under the harsh lights, and they had assumed she was a problem instead of a person. The manager stiffened. You could have asked for assistance, he snapped, as if that justified the insult, as if her answer made her more guilty instead of less. The Mafia boss's son finally turned his head, casting a gaze so calm and cold that the manager's breath hitched. She did not need assistance, he said. She needed respect. The room froze again. His words did not rise, did not bark, did not threaten. They simply held the truth with a steady firmness that cut deeper than anger ever could. The waitress felt something unfamiliar stir inside her chest. It was not fear. It was not relief. It was the rare feeling of being seen. Seen not as someone who did not belong, but as someone whose dignity mattered. The Mafia boss's son continued studying her, his gaze thoughtful. He noticed the tiny tremor in her fingers, the effort she used to keep her posture steady. He noticed the exhaustion that clung to her shoulders like a heavy coat. He noticed the strength in her stillness. And he recognized it because he had lived with masks of his own, masks that hid battles no one wanted to understand. "Where do you work?" he asked gently. "At the diner on 5th Street, she answered. "I have the evening shift. It is a long walk from here, but I wanted to look at the shoes before they closed." Her honesty felt like a quiet confession. There was no dramatics in her voice, no plea for sympathy. Only truth, pure and unpolished. The Mafia boss's son nodded slowly, as if her words were confirming something he already suspected. The customers watched with wide eyes. They had expected fear. From her. They had expected begging or apology. But she stood tall, answering with calm strength. The manager exhaled loudly, frustrated that no one was agreeing with him. "Sir, she is distracting customers. She is lowering the image of this store." The Mafia boss's son stepped closer to the manager, not aggressively, but with enough quiet authority to make the older man stumble backward. "The only thing lowering the image of this store," he said, "is the way you speak to a woman who has done nothing wrong." A hush swept the room. The waitress felt her heart tighten, not with fear, but with a strange and rising courage. For the first time since the insult, she felt the store's bright lights shift away from shaming her and toward illuminating the truth. And deep inside her chest, beneath her steady breath and her trembling hands, she felt something else. The beginning of a change. The moment before the moment. The quiet before everything would turn. The manager tried to speak again, but the words tangled in his throat when the Mafia boss's son turned fully toward him. The room felt colder, tighter, as if every wall leaned closer to witness what would happen next. The customers stood still, their breaths held, their bags dangling from frozen hands. Even the soft hum of the store's air conditioning seemed to quiet itself. The pregnant waitress felt her baby shift inside her belly, a small turn that reminded her she was not standing here alone. Her heartbeat steadied. She kept her hands over her stomach, grounding herself as the tension in the room thickened. The Mafia boss's son did not step back and did not raise his voice. Instead, he looked at the manager with the calm of a man who was used to ending storms by simply refusing to be moved by them. Then he turned his gaze back to the waitress, and something softened in his expression. Not pity, recognition, understanding. Something that said her presence mattered far more than anyone in this store had allowed themselves to believe. "What did he say to you?" he asked her gently. The question floated across the room with a weight that made every spine tighten. She swallowed, her throat dry. She did not want to repeat the words, but she also understood the importance of truth. Her voice came out quiet but steady. "He told me to get out," she said. "He said people like me do not belong here." The words trembled at the edges, not because she was weak, but because cruelty always cut deeper when spoken aloud. A faint gasp rippled through the crowd. Even those who had remained silent felt the sting of those words now that they were exposed under the bright lights. The Mafia boss's son lowered his eyes for a second, just enough to show he heard the pain in her voice. When he raised them again, the softness had disappeared, replaced by something colder and sharper. He shifted his stance slightly, placing himself more firmly between her and the manager, a silent signal that her dignity would no longer be left unprotected. The manager forced a laugh, thin and nervous. "Sir, she is exaggerating. I only meant that this store has standards." The Mafia boss's son took one step closer, reducing the distance between them to a breath. "Your standard," he said slowly, "is the problem." The manager blinked rapidly. "Sir, please, you do not understand. These people come in all the time. The Mafia boss's son raised a hand, stopping him instantly. The gesture was small, but its authority was enormous. Even his bodyguard straightened as if responding to a silent command. The room held its breath. The waitress pressed a hand to her belly again, calming the faint flutter beneath her palm. She had stood through insults before, but no one had ever stepped between her and cruelty with this kind of force. The Mafia boss's son turned toward her once more, his voice lower now, meant only for her. "Did he threaten you?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "No," she said. "He just wanted me out." The Mafia boss's son nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement, a sign that he believed her and that her voice carried weight. He turned back to the manager. The shift in the air was immediate. His jaw tightened slightly. His eyes darkened with a slow-burning resolve. The entire room seemed to tilt around him. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm and even, but it carried the quiet force of a verdict. You owe her an apology. The manager stared at him, stunned. What? You heard me. The mafia boss's son said. You insulted her. You disrespected her. You tried to throw her out while she is carrying a child. You will apologize. The manager looked around desperately, but no one came to his defense. The customers stared at him with judgment in their eyes. The bodyguards watched him with unblinking faces carved from stone. The pregnant waitress stood behind the mafia boss's son, her breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding. No one had ever demanded respect for her. Not like this. Not with the full weight of the room pressing down on the man who had tried to shame her. And for the first time since she had entered the store, she felt something warm rise in her chest. A new kind of strength. A new kind of power, born not from anger, but from the simple truth that she deserved to be treated with dignity. It was the moment the entire room finally understood that the balance of power had shifted, and it was not shifting back. The manager's face drained of color as the words settled over the room like falling ash. You will apologize. No one moved. No one breathed. The luxury store that had moments ago been filled with quiet music and soft conversations now held a tension so sharp it felt like the lights themselves were vibrating. The pregnant waitress stood behind the mafia boss's son, her hands resting on her belly, feeling her child shift beneath her palms. Her breath was slow and steady, but inside her chest, her heart beat with a rhythm she had never known before. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was something stronger. Something she had forgotten she was allowed to feel. Worth. The manager opened his mouth, but before a single word escaped, the mafia boss's son leaned forward just slightly, his voice soft but edged with steel. I will give you one chance, he said. Do not waste it. The customers watched with wide, unblinking eyes. A woman near the fitting rooms covered her mouth with her hand. A young man by the door took a half step back, as if expecting the floor to crack open. The manager forced a tiny laugh, brittle and shaking. Sir, surely this is unnecessary. This woman is exaggerating. He stopped, because the mafia boss's son turned his head. Just that. A small, quiet turn. But the look in his eyes froze every word in the manager's throat. It was not rage. It was not violence. It was disappointment sharpened into a blade. The kind of look given by someone who had endured far worse and would not tolerate cruelty masquerading as professionalism. The manager swallowed hard, then finally looked at the waitress. But before he could speak, the mafia boss's son asked her something that made the entire room tilt. What do you want him to say? The question was simple, but it struck her like a light inside her chest. No one had ever asked her what she wanted in these moments. No one had ever given her power. Her breath trembled. She looked at the manager. His eyes darted everywhere except toward her. And in that moment, she realized something. An apology would not erase the words he had thrown at her. It would not erase the humiliation. But she did not want him afraid. She wanted him aware. She wanted him to see her. To see the baby she was carrying. To see that every person he dismissed had a whole life behind their tired eyes. She lifted her chin, her voice gentle but unwavering. I want him to acknowledge what he did, she said. I want him to understand I am a person, not a problem. Her words floated across the room with quiet weight. The mafia boss's son nodded once, affirming her answer. Then he turned back to the trembling manager. You will speak to her, he said. Not at her. To her. The manager's throat bobbed as he swallowed. I am sorry, he muttered quickly, barely looking up. But the mafia boss's son did not move. Did not blink. Did not allow the moment to pass so easily. Look at her, he said. The manager lifted his gaze with visible effort. The room held its breath. The waitress met his eyes, not with spite or triumph, but with a calm that surprised even herself. Waiting. The manager exhaled shakily. I am sorry for the way I spoke to you, he said, each word squeezed out with difficulty. I should not have said that you do not belong here. I should not have treated you that way. For the first time since she had stepped into the store, the waitress felt the weight inside her chest loosen. Not fully, not completely, but enough. Enough to breathe. She nodded once, accepting the apology, not because it fixed anything, but because she refused to let someone else's cruelty live rent-free inside her heart. The mafia boss's son watched her with a look of quiet approval, as if recognizing her strength in the way she chose dignity over revenge. But the moment was not done. Not yet. Because the manager, desperate to salvage control, made one final mistake. His voice cracked as he added, "Now that this is handled, she can leave." The store froze again. The Mafia boss's son turned his head slowly, and the thin thread holding the manager's composure snapped. The next moment would not belong to the manager. It would belong to her. And with 3 quiet words, the pregnant waitress was about to stop the entire room cold. The moment the manager said she could leave, the entire store seemed to stop breathing again. The pregnant waitress felt the familiar sting rising in her chest, the old reflex to shrink, to back away, to disappear before more harm could reach her. But tonight felt different. Tonight she had stood long enough, endured enough, and something inside her finally refused to bend. The Mafia boss's son turned toward her as if he could feel that shift happening within her. His eyes studied her face, the slow inhale she took, the way her hands settled over her belly, as if grounding both herself and the child she carried. He did not speak. He did not give her instructions. He simply waited, letting her choose what happened next. The manager, misunderstanding the silence, tried to reclaim what little power he believed he still held. "We apologized," he said sharply, his voice trembling with forced authority. "So now she can leave quietly, and we can move on." But the moment he finished speaking, the pregnant waitress lifted her chin. The baby shifted beneath her palm, as if urging her forward. Her voice rose, soft but unbreakable, cutting through the air with a clarity that silenced every whisper. "I am not leaving." 3 words. Simple, calm, spoken without anger, but carrying a weight that dropped into the center of the room like a stone into still water. "I am not leaving." The customers felt the shift immediately. Their eyes widened. A woman near the register pressed a hand to her chest. The young man by the door whispered, "Did she just say that?" Even the bodyguards straightened, sensing the moment her dignity stepped fully into the light. The Mafia boss's son exhaled slowly, the ghost of a proud smile touching the corner of his lips. Not a wide smile, not a dramatic one, just a small, quiet acknowledgement that she had chosen courage over fear, presence over disappearance. The manager's face turned a blotchy shade of red. You cannot talk like that," he stammered. "You do not have the right to stay here." She does," the Mafia boss's son said, his voice cutting the manager off with effortless precision. "She has every right to stand where she is. She came to buy something. She will finish what she came for." The manager opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. The room had already shifted beyond his control. The pregnant waitress felt her breath ease, not because the confrontation was over, but because she had finally spoken the words she had carried in her heart for years. Words she had swallowed every time someone tried to shrink her. Words she had never allowed herself to say out loud. The Mafia boss's son stepped to her side, not in front of her this time, not as a shield, but as a witness. A recognition. An equal. She inhaled, letting her shoulders relax as the lights softened around her. She did not feel invisible anymore. She did not feel small. She felt seen. Real. Present. And the entire store, from the shining glass shelves to the trembling manager, understood that something irreversible had just happened. Her 3 words had stopped the room cold, and nothing would go back to the way it was before. The store felt charged with a new electricity as her 3 quiet words lingered in the air. "I am not leaving." They settled into every corner of the room, into every uneasy glance, into the very breath of the people who had watched her endure what none of them had the courage to confront. The manager stood frozen, his lips parted, his pride crumbling in front of the very customers he had tried so hard to impress. The pregnant waitress kept her hands over her belly as her child shifted softly beneath her palm, as if sensing the strength rising in her chest. The Mafia boss's son remained beside her, not stepping in front of her this time, but standing shoulder to shoulder with her, letting the room see that her voice was enough to command the space on its own. For a long moment, no one moved. Then a middle-aged woman near the back whispered, "Good for her." Another customer nodded slowly. A man raised his phone, recording the scene, capturing every second of the truth unfolding right in front of him. The manager gasped when he noticed several phones now pointed toward him, toward the woman he had insulted, toward the man standing beside her with the gravity of a verdict in his stance. "Stop recording," the manager snapped, his voice cracking. "You cannot record in here." But the Mafia boss's son looked at him, A single steady look that silenced the room more effectively than any policy ever could. The manager's shoulders sagged. The truth was already out. He could not control the narrative anymore. He could not erase what he had said. The pregnant waitress took a slow breath, grounding herself as the world finally shifted in her direction. The Mafia boss's son turned to one of his bodyguards and spoke calmly, his voice even and cold. "Close the store." The command rippled outward like thunder trapped inside velvet. The bodyguard nodded and moved to the front, turning the lock with a click that echoed through the marble floor. The customers gasped, startled but not frightened, instinctively understanding that this was not a threat. It was accountability. The doors were closed to keep the truth in, not to keep people out. The manager sputtered, "You cannot just shut down my store." But the Mafia boss's son corrected him with a quiet certainty. "This is not your store tonight." He gestured toward the pregnant woman. "It is hers." The weight of his words settled over the room like a new law being written in real time. The manager looked around desperately, but not one person in the store stepped up for him. Not one defended his behavior. Not one believed his excuses anymore. The pregnant waitress breathed in deeply, feeling the warmth of something she had nearly forgotten. Dignity. And she knew the world outside those locked doors would soon hear this story, because Justice had walked into the store tonight, wearing a simple blue dress, and carrying a child who would one day learn what strength looked like. When the doors finally unlocked, and the customers stepped out into the cool evening air, the story had already begun to spread. People whispered, replaying her 3 quiet words, replaying the moment the room shifted, replaying the look on the manager's face when he realized he had lost the power he thought he owned. The pregnant waitress stood near the exit, her hand resting gently on her belly as the baby settled into stillness, as if soothed by the steady rhythm of her breath. The Mafia boss's son paused beside her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You did not back down," he said. "Remember that. You stood for yourself." She nodded, her eyes soft but steady. "I just needed to be seen," she replied. He held her gaze for a quiet moment, then stepped back, letting her walk forward on her own. The staff kept their distance, the manager unable to meet her eyes, his pride cracked open for the world to see. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, curious faces, raised phones, murmurs of surprise and respect. Not pity, respect. She stepped into the evening light, her shoulders finally free of the weight she had carried inside that store. She did not raise her voice. She did not demand anything. She simply existed with a dignity no one could strip away anymore. And the world noticed. This story would travel far, whispered in homes, replayed on screens, carried like a reminder of what quiet courage looks like. She had walked into that store to buy a pair of shoes. She walked out having taught a lesson far heavier than leather and stitching. She did not shout. She did not threaten. She simply said 3 words that changed everything. Power means nothing without dignity. And tonight, this was her black story worth sharing. This cinematic narration unfolds a powerful tale of dignity, courage, and justice as a pregnant black waitress stands her ground after being humiliated by a store manager, only for the son of a mafia boss to witness her strength and shift the balance of the entire room. This emotionally intense story highlights themes of humanity, respect, and moral reversal, making it a compelling addition to modern black stories that resonate deeply with audiences. As the confrontation unfolds, the manager's cruelty is exposed, customers record the incident, and the woman's quiet bravery transforms a moment of humiliation into a lesson about worth, making it one of the most unforgettable black stories to share. Her 3 simple words freeze the room, reminding viewers that real power is found in dignity, truth, and courage, echoing the essence of impactful black stories that uplift the human spirit. This video is crafted for viewers who seek meaningful black stories that challenge injustice and amplify the strength of those too often overlooked.